The greatest historical lies that built Christianity. Unveiling the truth. The history you were taught in Sunday school isn't just incomplete. It's fabricated. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about the origins of Christianity. Because buried beneath centuries of doctrine and devotion lies a web of deception so intricate, so carefully constructed that it fooled billions of people for over 2,000 years. Today, we're diving into the forbidden archives of religious history to expose the greatest lies ever told. These aren't minor inconsistencies or harmless embellishments. These are foundational falsehoods that shaped the world's largest religion from its very beginning. And once you see them, you'll never be able to look at Christianity the same way again. But here's what makes this story even more shocking. Every single fabrication was intentional. Every contradiction was covered up. Every historical gap was filled with fiction. This wasn't ignorance or accident. This was calculated manipulation on a scale that would make modern propaganda campaigns look like amateur hour. So, buckle up because we're about to journey through 20 centuries of the most audacious religious fraud in human history. By the end of this series, you'll understand exactly how a small apocalyptic Jewish sect transformed into a global empire built on lies. And trust me, the deeper we go, the more disturbing it becomes. Let's start with the most sacred story in all of Christianity, the birth of Jesus Christ. You know the tale by heart. Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem for a Roman census. Jesus is born in a stable fulfilling ancient prophecy. It's beautiful. It's moving. And it's completely false. Here's the first massive red flag that historians have known about for decades, but rarely discussed publicly. There is absolutely no historical record of any Roman census that required people to return to their ancestral hometowns. None. Zero. This isn't just unusual. It's unprecedented and completely illogical. Think about this for a moment. The Romans were master administrators. They built the most efficient bureaucratic system the ancient world had ever seen. Their entire empire depended on accurate taxation and population records. So why would they create a census system that was guaranteed to fail? Imagine trying to count and tax people based on where their great-great-grandfather lived 1,000 years ago. It's administrative suicide. People wouldn't know their ancestral towns. Records didn't exist. Entire family lines had been scattered by wars, famines, and migrations. The Romans would have created chaos instead of collecting taxes. But here's what Roman censuses actually looked like. They counted people where they lived and worked, where they owned property, where they could be taxed. This wasn't just practical. It was essential for the empire's survival. Every legitimate Roman census we have records of follows this exact pattern. So why does the Gospel of Luke invent this impossible scenario? Because the writers had a problem. They needed Jesus to be born in Bethlehem to fulfill Hebrew prophecy. But everyone knew he was from Nazareth. The solution was to fabricate a reason for his parents to travel to Bethlehem at just the right moment. This is storytelling, not history. And it gets worse when you realize that Matthew and Luke, the only two Gospels that mention the birth story, give completely different and contradictory accounts of how Jesus ended up in Bethlehem. They couldn't even coordinate their lies properly. But the census fabrication is just the tip of the iceberg. Let's talk about those famous genealogies that supposedly prove Jesus descended from King David. Both Matthew and Luke provide detailed family trees connecting Jesus to the royal line. There's just one problem. They completely contradict each other. Matthew traces Jesus through David's son, Solomon. Luke traces him through David's son, Nathan. Not only do they disagree on this crucial point, but they contradict each other on virtually every generation between David and Jesus. We're not talking about minor discrepancies here. These are two entirely different family trees. Now, some defenders of Christianity claim one genealogy is for Mary and the other for Joseph. But that's not what the texts say. Both genealogies explicitly state they're tracing Joseph's lineage, not Mary's. And here's where the whole thing falls apart completely. If Jesus was born of a virgin, then Joseph isn't his biological father. Which means Joseph's ancestry is completely irrelevant to Jesus's divine bloodline. You can't have it both ways. Either Jesus inherits his royal lineage through Joseph or he's born of a virgin. The two claims are mutually exclusive. Yet, the Gospel writers go to extraordinary lengths to prove Joseph descended from David, as if that somehow makes Jesus the rightful heir to the throne. It's a theological contradiction so obvious that it should have unraveled the entire narrative. But instead of asking hard questions, people just accepted both impossible claims simultaneously. This brings us to perhaps the most pivotal deception of all: the virgin birth itself. For centuries, Christians have been told that the Hebrew prophet Isaiah predicted a virgin would give birth to the Messiah. This prophecy supposedly proves Jesus was divine. But it's based on a translation error. The Hebrew word used in Isaiah is Alma, which simply means young woman. It doesn't mean virgin. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek centuries later, the translators used the word pathos, which can mean virgin, but doesn't necessarily mean virgin. Can also just mean young woman. But early Christian writers seized on this ambiguous translation and built one of Christianity's most central doctrines around it. The virgin birth became so fundamental to Christian theology that questioning it is considered heresy in most denominations. Let that sink in for a moment. One of the most sacred miracles in Christianity, the claim that Jesus was born of a virgin, is built not on prophecy, not on history, not on divine revelation, but on a translator's mistake. A single mistranslated word became the foundation for a belief that defines the faith. What makes this even more revealing is that the earliest gospel, Mark, never mentions a virgin birth at all. Neither does Paul, the earliest Christian writer. The virgin birth story only appears in Matthew and Luke, which were written decades later. If this was such a crucial part of Jesus' story, why didn't the earliest Christians know about it? The answer is simple: because it hadn't been invented yet. The virgin birth narrative was a later addition, crafted to make Jesus compete with other dying and rising gods in the ancient world. Religions across the Mediterranean featured divine births, miraculous conceptions, and gods born of virgins. Christianity needed its own version to attract converts from these competing faiths. But even Matthew and Luke can't agree on the details of their fabricated birth story. Matthew, to divorce Mary quietly, says Joseph went when he discovered her pregnancy. Luke says Joseph never doubted her at all. These aren't minor inconsistencies. They're fundamental contradictions about the characters' motivations and actions. Every single element of the nativity story falls apart under scrutiny. The star that guides the wise men defies astronomy. The massacre of infants by Herod has no historical record. The flight to Egypt serves no purpose except to fulfill more prophecies. Each detail is crafted not to record history, but to retrofit Jesus into ancient expectations about what the Messiah should be. And here's what's truly disturbing about all this. These aren't innocent mistakes or understandable embellishments. These are calculated deceptions designed to convince people that Jesus fulfilled prophecies he never actually fulfilled. The Gospel writers knew exactly what they were doing when they invented these stories. They needed Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, so they created an impossible census. They needed him to descend from David, so they fabricated genealogies that contradict each other. They needed him to be born of a virgin, so they mistranslated Hebrew prophecy. Every problem was solved with a lie. But here's the question that should keep you awake at night. If the foundation of Christianity is built on such obvious fabrications, what does that say about everything else? If the earliest Christian writers were willing to invent Jesus' birth story out of whole cloth, what other parts of his life did they fabricate? We're just getting started. Because the birth story is only the beginning of a pattern of deception that runs through every major event in Jesus' supposed life. From his missing childhood to his undocumented ministry. From his contradictory teachings to his impossible miracles. The story becomes more unbelievable the closer you look. And that's before we even get to the resurrection. Christianity's ultimate claim and its most problematic story. Because if you think the birth narrative is full of holes, wait until you see what happens when we examine the accounts of Jesus' death and supposed return to life. The truth is, Christianity wasn't built on divine revelation. It was constructed through human manipulation, political calculation, and theological innovation. Every sacred story was crafted to serve a purpose. Every miracle was designed to impress an audience. Every prophecy was retrofitted to create the illusion of divine plan. What we're uncovering isn't just historical inaccuracy. It's systematic fraud on a scale that boggles the mind. And the most shocking part is how successful it's been. For 2 millennia, these fabrications have been accepted as sacred truth by billions of people. They've shaped laws, justified wars, and controlled entire civilizations. But the house of cards is starting to tumble. Modern scholarship, archaeological evidence, and historical analysis are revealing just how thoroughly the story of Christianity has been manipulated. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. This is just the beginning of our journey into forbidden history. What we've covered today represents the foundation of Christianity's deception. But there's so much more to uncover. In our next episode, we'll dive deeper into the historical silence that surrounds Jesus' life and explore why the most famous man in history left absolutely no contemporary trace of his existence. Because if the birth story is fabricated and if the genealogies are contradictory, and if the virgin birth is based on mistranslation, then what evidence do we actually have that Jesus existed at all? The answer might surprise you. The silence surrounding Jesus' historical existence is deafening. And I mean that literally. For a man who supposedly performed miracles in front of thousands, overturned tables in the temple, and drew crowds so large they required miraculous feedings, the historical record is eerily quiet. We're talking about 1st century Palestine, one of the most documented regions in the ancient world. The Romans kept meticulous records. Jewish historians chronicled every minor prophet and political uprising. Greek writers documented social movements across the empire. Yet somehow, the most extraordinary figure in human history managed to slip through every single historical net. This isn't just surprising. It's impossible. Unless, of course, the Jesus described in the Gospels never existed in the first place. Let me put this in perspective. We have detailed records about obscure peasant revolts, minor Jewish prophets, and forgotten political prisoners from the same time period. Josephus, the premier Jewish historian of the 1st century, wrote extensively about Palestine during Jesus' supposed lifetime. He mentions every significant religious figure, every political movement, every social disturbance. But his authentic writings contain virtually nothing about Jesus. And before you bring up the famous passage in Josephus that mentions Jesus, let me save you the embarrassment. That passage is a later Christian insertion added by scribes centuries after Josephus died. Modern scholars across the theological spectrum agree it's a forgery. The writing style is wrong. The theology is anachronistic and it interrupts the flow of Josephus's narrative. But here's what's really telling. Josephus wrote about John the Baptist in detail. He described the Baptist's teachings, his followers, his execution by Herod. If Jesus was John's contemporary and successor, if he was the more famous of the two, why does Josephus barely acknowledge his existence in his authentic writings? The answer is becoming clearer the more we dig. The Jesus of the Gospels, the miracle worker, the crowd drawer, the temple cleanser, is a literary creation. He's not based on historical documentation because there was no historical documentation to base him on. This brings us to one of Christianity's most audacious claims. The story of the 500 witnesses to the resurrection. The Apostle Paul, writing in his first letter to the Corinthians around 55 CE, makes this bold assertion. Over 500 people saw the risen Jesus at one time, and most of them were still alive when Paul wrote his letter. That sounds impressive until you start asking questions. Who were these 500 people? What were their names? Where did this massive gathering take place? When did it happen? Why didn't anyone else write about this extraordinary event? Paul provides no details whatsoever. No location. No date. No cross-references. No independent confirmations. It's a phantom crowd. A number thrown out to sound convincing without any supporting evidence. And here's the really damning part. The Gospels written after Paul's letters never mention this crowd of 500 witnesses. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all had access to Paul's writings and the core stories of early Christianity. If 500 people really witnessed the resurrection, why didn't the Gospel writers include this stunning confirmation of their central claim? You simply cannot explain this omission if the event actually occurred. It would be like writing a biography of a celebrity and forgetting to mention they won an Academy Award. The only reasonable explanation is that Paul fabricated the story to bolster his theological arguments. And this reveals something crucial about Paul's relationship to the historical Jesus. Paul never met Jesus during his alleged lifetime. He wasn't present at the crucifixion. He didn't witness the empty tomb. His entire understanding of Jesus came through visions and mystical experiences, not real-world encounters. Yet Paul became the primary architect of Christian theology. He wrote more books of the New Testament than any other author. His interpretation of Jesus' significance shaped the entire faith. But his Jesus was a spiritual being, not a historical figure. This disconnect between Paul's mystical Christ and the Gospel's biographical Jesus creates massive problems for Christian claims about historical accuracy. If the earliest and most influential Christian writer had no direct knowledge of Jesus' earthly life, how reliable can any of the stories be? The answer becomes even more troubling when we examine the resurrection accounts themselves. Because not only is there no independent historical evidence for this supposedly world-changing event, but the Gospel stories contradict each other so dramatically that they can't all be true. Let's start with the earliest Gospel, Mark. In its original ending, before later scribes added verses to match the other Gospels, Mark concludes with women discovering an empty tomb and running away in fear. They tell no one what they've seen. That's it. No appearances by the risen Jesus. No miraculous encounters. Just silence and terror. This original ending of Mark is so abrupt and unsatisfying that ancient scribes couldn't leave it alone. They added verses borrowed from the other Gospels to create a proper resurrection scene. But these additions are obvious forgeries. The writing style changes. The vocabulary shifts. And the theology evolves beyond what Mark originally taught. Matthew tries to improve on Mark's story by adding guards at the tomb and an earthquake. But he creates new problems in the process. Why would Roman soldiers agree to spread a lie that would get them executed? Why would Jewish authorities pay guards to admit they fell asleep on duty? A capital offense in the Roman army. Luke goes in a different direction, entirely featuring a dramatic walk to Emmaus where Jesus appears to two disciples, but somehow they don't recognize him until he breaks bread. It's a beautiful story, but it has nothing in common with Mark's terrified women or Matthew's earthquake and guards. John writing last creates the most elaborate resurrection narrative of all. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in the garden, then to the disciples in a locked room. Then again to include Thomas, who demands physical proof. Each appearance becomes more detailed, more miraculous, more impossible to verify. These aren't just different perspectives on the same event. They're incompatible accounts that cannot be reconciled. If the resurrection really happened, there should be one consistent story, not four contradictory versions that grow more elaborate over time. But the contradictions don't stop with the resurrection appearances. The Gospel accounts disagree on fundamental details about Jesus' death and burial. Who carried the cross? What were Jesus' last words? Who was present at the crucifixion? When did the darkness fall? How long did Jesus hang on the cross? Every Gospel gives different answers to these basic questions. John says Jesus carried his own cross. The others say Simon of Cyrene helped him. Mark records Jesus' last words as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Luke says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." John claims he said, "It is finished." These aren't minor discrepancies. They're fundamental contradictions about the most important moment in Christian history. Would eyewitnesses forget what their teacher said with his dying breath? Would they disagree about who helped carry the instrument of his execution? The only explanation that makes sense is that these accounts weren't written by eyewitnesses at all. They were composed by anonymous authors decades later, crafting their own version of events to serve their theological purposes. And that brings us to perhaps the most devastating revelation of all. None of the Gospels were actually written by the people whose names they bear. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are traditional attributions added long after the texts were completed. The original manuscripts were anonymous. Biblical scholars across the theological spectrum, from conservative evangelicals to secular historians, agree that the Gospels were written between 70 and 100 CE, roughly 40 to 70 years after the events they describe. That's 2 full generations of oral tradition, theological development, and political change. Imagine trying to write an accurate biography of someone from the 1950s using only stories you heard from people who heard them from other people. Now imagine that those stories had been filtered through decades of religious interpretation, community politics, and doctrinal disputes. That's what we're dealing with in the Gospels. But it gets worse. The Gospel of Mark, believed to be the earliest, shows clear signs of being written after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Jesus supposedly predicts this event. But the prophecy is so detailed and accurate that it had to have been written after the fact. This is prophecy after the fact, a common literary technique in ancient religious writing. If Mark was written after 70 CE and Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source while adding their own theological interpretations, then we're looking at documents composed 40 to 60 years after the alleged events by people who had no direct access to eyewitness testimony. This timeline destroys any claim that the Gospels preserve accurate historical memory. By the time these stories were written down, everyone who might have known the historical Jesus was dead. The authors were working with oral traditions that had been shaped by decades of theological development and community needs. And those oral traditions weren't neutral historical accounts. They were shaped by the specific needs of early Christian communities. Each gospel was written for a different audience with different concerns. Matthew emphasizes Jesus' fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, because he's writing for a Jewish Christian community. Luke softens the harsh edges because he's writing for Gentile converts. John creates a cosmic Christ figure, because he's writing for communities that had fully embraced Jesus' divinity. These differences aren't just stylistic. They're theological. The Jesus of Mark is a suffering human who feels abandoned by God. The Jesus of John is a divine being who controls every aspect of his fate. These are 2 fundamentally different characters, not different perspectives on the same person. What we're seeing isn't the preservation of historical memory. It's the evolution of religious mythology. Each gospel writer took the traditions available to them and shaped them into a story that served their community's needs. Truth was secondary to theological utility. This process of mythological development explains why the resurrection stories become more elaborate over time, why the miracles become more spectacular in later Gospels, and why Jesus' divine nature becomes more explicit as the decades pass. It's not because new evidence was discovered. It's because the mythology was growing more sophisticated. And that mythology didn't develop in a vacuum. Early Christianity was competing with dozens of other mystery religions across the Roman Empire. Many of these faiths featured dying and rising gods, virgin births, miraculous healings, and promises of eternal life. Christianity had to offer something comparable to attract converts. The gospel writers weren't just preserving history. They were creating a compelling religious narrative that could compete in the marketplace of ancient spirituality. Every miracle, every prophecy fulfillment, every dramatic scene was designed to demonstrate that Jesus was superior to the gods of competing religions. This competitive pressure explains why Christian stories become more miraculous over time, not less. If historical accuracy were the goal, we'd expect the opposite. Later accounts would strip away legendary elements to focus on verifiable facts. Instead, we see constant embellishment and theological development. The pattern is clear once you see it. Christianity wasn't built on historical truth. It was constructed through religious imagination, theological innovation, and competitive mythology. Every sacred story was crafted to serve a purpose, not to preserve a memory. But this brings us to an even more disturbing question. If the stories were fabricated and the eyewitnesses were invented, then how did Christianity manage to survive long enough to become a world religion? The answer lies in one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns, built on a foundation of manufactured martyrs and political opportunism. You've probably heard the stirring tales of early Christian martyrs, brave believers who chose death over denying their faith. Peter crucified upside down in Rome. Paul beheaded by Nero. Christians thrown to lions in the Colosseum. These stories have been used for centuries to validate the faith. After all, who would die for a lie? But here's what they don't tell you in Sunday school. Most of these martyrdom stories are complete fiction invented long after the alleged events to create an emotional foundation for the growing religion. Let's start with Peter's supposed crucifixion in Rome. There's absolutely no contemporary Roman record of this execution. None. The story first appears in apocryphal texts, written more than a century later by Christian authors who had every reason to embellish their history. For an empire that documented every significant execution, the complete absence of records about Christianity's supposed first pope is telling. The same pattern repeats with Paul's alleged beheading, Stephen's stoning, and countless other martyrdom tales. These stories surface decades or centuries after they supposedly occurred, always in Christian sources, never in independent historical records. But here's what makes this deception even more calculated. Early Christian writings show no consistent picture of widespread persecution. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian texts, describes communities living peacefully alongside their pagan neighbors. Letters from church leaders indicate that Christians often integrated successfully into Roman society. So why fabricate mass martyrdom? Because martyrdom is the ultimate validation technique. If you can convince people that your movement is built on the blood of heroes, that its truth is so sacred it costs lives, then questioning that narrative becomes not just wrong. It becomes sacrilege. It transforms belief into a battlefield where doubt equals betrayal. And it creates an emotional bond that's almost impossible to break. When people believe their ancestors died for a cause, they'll defend that cause even when evidence proves it false. But the martyrdom mythology serves another crucial function. It distracts from Christianity's real history of expansion. Because Christianity didn't conquer the world through grassroots evangelism or divine favor. It succeeded through imperial force, political calculation, and systematic destruction of competing religions. The turning point came in the early 4th century with Emperor Constantine. But Constantine's conversion wasn't a spiritual awakening. It was a political masterstroke. The Roman Empire was fracturing. Traditional paganism couldn't unify the diverse populations under Roman rule. Constantine needed a single narrative powerful enough to bind together millions of people across different cultures and languages. Christianity, with its promise of universal salvation, and its growing network of bishops and infrastructure, offered the perfect solution. So Constantine adopted the cross not out of faith but out of strategy. The Council of Nicea in 325 CE wasn't convened to preserve divine truth. It was organized to end theological disagreements that threatened political stability. Constantine needed doctrinal unity to maintain imperial unity. He didn't care which version of Christianity won as long as there was only one version. From that moment forward, Christianity stopped being a movement of the oppressed and became the tool of oppressors. Pagan temples were destroyed or converted into churches. Competing Christian sects were branded as heretics and persecuted. Ancient libraries containing alternative religious texts were burned. The religion of supposed love and peace became the machinery of conquest and control. And what about the biblical texts themselves? The Bible that millions revere as the pure Word of God was assembled under imperial pressure by councils of men motivated by politics and power. Books were chosen based on their usefulness to imperial Christianity, not their historical accuracy or spiritual authenticity. Gospels that presented alternative views of Jesus, like the Gospel of Thomas with its emphasis on inner wisdom, or the Gospel of Mary, which featured a female disciple in a leadership role, were labeled heretical and systematically destroyed. We only know these texts existed because a few copies survived hidden in desert caves or buried in ancient libraries. The canonical Gospels weren't selected because they were more authentic. They were chosen because they supported the version of Christianity that served imperial interests. A religion that emphasized individual spiritual experience couldn't be controlled by emperors and bishops. But a religion built on institutional authority and doctrinal conformity was perfect for maintaining political power. This process of selection and censorship continued for centuries. Every time Christianity expanded into new territories, local religious traditions were suppressed or absorbed. Indigenous spiritual practices were demonized. Sacred sites were claimed and converted. Entire cultures were told their ancestors had been deceived by evil spirits. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the forced conversion of indigenous peoples in the Americas. All of this flowed directly from the imperial transformation of Christianity under Constantine. The religion that claimed to follow a teacher who preached turning the other cheek became history's most successful war machine. But even this brutal expansion required constant mythological maintenance. Every conquest had to be justified as divine will. Every atrocity had to be reframed as holy mission. The gap between Christian teachings and Christian actions became so vast that it required increasingly sophisticated theological gymnastics to bridge. This is where the doctrine of divine mystery became crucial. Whenever Christian behavior contradicted Christian teachings, believers were told that God's ways are mysterious and beyond human understanding. It was the ultimate conversation stopper, a way to shut down critical thinking while maintaining the illusion of moral authority. Consider the absurdity of this position. Jesus supposedly preached humility, yet his followers built palaces of gold. He called for peace, yet they launched holy wars. He rejected worldly power, yet they crowned popes like kings and claimed divine authority over entire continents. The cognitive dissonance should have been unbearable. But the mythology was so powerful, the social pressure so intense, and the consequences of doubt so severe that people learned to compartmentalize these contradictions rather than confront them. This psychological manipulation reached its peak during the medieval period when the Catholic Church achieved near total control over European thought. Literacy was restricted to the clergy. Biblical texts were kept in Latin, people from reading them. Scientific to prevent ordinary inquiry was suppressed if it contradicted religious doctrine. The Church didn't just control what people believed, it controlled what they were allowed to know. Alternative explanations for natural phenomena were branded as heresy. Historical documents that contradicted official church history were destroyed or hidden. Even mathematical concepts like zero were initially rejected because they didn't fit Christian cosmology. This wasn't ignorance. It was systematic information control designed to maintain religious authority. The Church understood that knowledge is power, and they weren't about to share that power with the masses they sought to control. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this deception was how it corrupted the very concept of truth itself. In traditional philosophical thinking, truth is what corresponds to reality. But Christianity redefined truth as whatever supports the faith regardless of evidence. This theological innovation had catastrophic consequences for human intellectual development. It taught people that believing without evidence was virtuous, that questioning authority was sinful, and that faith was superior to reason. These ideas didn't just damage religious thinking. They poisoned entire cultures' approach to knowledge and inquiry. We're still living with the consequences today. The anti-intellectual strain in modern Christianity. The rejection of scientific evidence that contradicts religious beliefs. the tendency to dismiss inconvenient facts as persecution. All of this traces back to the fundamental dishonesty built into Christianity's foundation. When you construct a religion on lies, you have to keep lying to maintain it. Every challenge to the mythology requires new explanations, fresh apologetic, creative reinterpretations. The theological industry exists primarily to explain away problems with Christian claims, not to pursue truth wherever it leads. This brings us to a crucial realization about the nature of religious authority itself. Christianity's power doesn't come from its truth claims. It comes from its ability to make people stop asking questions. The moment believers start examining the evidence critically, the whole edifice begins to crumble. That's why religious education focuses on faith rather than facts. Why doubts are treated as spiritual problems rather than intellectual honesty. And why leaving the faith is portrayed as moral failure rather than rational conclusion. The greatest trick Christianity ever pulled wasn't convincing people that God exists. It was convincing them that questioning God's existence makes them bad people. This moral manipulation is far more powerful than logical argument, because it attacks the questioner's character, rather than addressing their concerns. But once you see this manipulation for what it is, once you recognize the patterns of deception woven throughout Christian history, you can never unsee them. Every Sunday service becomes a performance. Every prayer becomes a conversation with silence. Every sacred text becomes a human document shaped by very human needs and limitations. And that recognition is profoundly liberating. Because when you stop defending lies, you can start pursuing truth. When you stop fearing divine punishment for honest questions, you can start thinking clearly. When you stop accepting authority without evidence, you can start making decisions based on reality rather than mythology. The lies that built Christianity weren't minor embellishments or innocent mistakes. They were fundamental deceptions that shaped the course of human history. From the fabricated birth narrative to the manufactured martyrs. From the forged documents to the imperial propaganda. Every major element of Christian history has been distorted to serve power rather than truth. What we're witnessing isn't just the collapse of a religious narrative. It's the exposure of history's most successful fraud. A fraud so comprehensive, so persistent, and so emotionally manipulative that it convinced billions of people to dedicate their lives to defending lies they never had permission to examine. But the evidence is undeniable once you're willing to look at it honestly. The contradictions are too numerous to ignore. The historical gaps are too vast to bridge. The patterns of deception are too consistent to dismiss. Christianity as we know it today isn't the product of divine revelation. It's the result of human ambition, political calculation, and theological innovation. Every sacred story was crafted to serve a purpose. Every miracle was designed to impress an audience. Every doctrine was formulated to maintain control. And the most tragic part of all this isn't that people were deceived, is that they were taught to call their deception faith, their ignorance humility, and their intellectual surrender virtue. But truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deeply it's buried. And once it emerges, no amount of theological explanation can put it back in the ground. The lies that built Christianity are finally being exposed for what they are. And what comes next will determine whether humanity can finally move beyond the mythology that has constrained human thinking for 2 millennia. The most disturbing revelation about Christianity's fabricated history isn't just what was invented. It's what was systematically erased. Because while church authorities were busy constructing their mythology, they were simultaneously destroying every piece of evidence that contradicted their narrative. This wasn't accidental preservation failure. This was deliberate historical vandalism on an unprecedented scale. Let's talk about what happened to the libraries. The ancient world was home to some of humanity's greatest repositories of knowledge. The Library of Alexandria, the libraries of Pergamon, the vast collections in Athens and Rome. These weren't just book-true information that contradicted Christian claims. Historical Christianity gained political power. These centers of learning became targets. not storage facilities. They were research centers where scholars from across the known world gathered to study, debate, and preserve human knowledge. But because they contained false information. But because they contained records that showed no evidence of Jesus' existence. Philosophical treatises that explained natural phenomena without invoking divine intervention. Scientific observations that contradicted biblical cosmology. The destruction wasn't random. It was systematic. Christian authorities knew exactly which documents threatened their narrative. And they hunted them down with remarkable efficiency. We're not talking about a few scattered incidents. This was a coordinated campaign that lasted centuries and eliminated millions of documents. Consider what we've lost. We have fragments of works by over 1,000 Greek and Roman authors. But complete works from fewer than 200. The missing pieces aren't random. They're specifically the works that would have provided contemporary accounts of first-century Palestine, alternative religious perspectives, and scientific knowledge that contradicted church doctrine. But the destruction of external sources was only the beginning. Christianity's most audacious fraud was the systematic alteration of its own foundational documents. The New Testament texts that millions consider sacred and unchangeable have been modified, edited, and rewritten thousands of times across the centuries. Modern biblical scholars have identified over 400,000 variations between surviving manuscripts of the New Testament. That's not 400. That's 400,000 differences. Some are minor spelling changes, but others are major theological alterations that completely change the meaning of passages. The most famous example is the story of the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel. Jesus supposedly says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." It's one of Christianity's most beloved stories, quoted countless times to demonstrate Jesus' compassion and wisdom. But it doesn't appear in the earliest manuscripts. It was added centuries later by scribes who thought the story improved their theological point. The ending of Mark's Gospel, which we discussed earlier, isn't the only major addition. Entire passages about the Trinity, Jesus' divine nature, and key resurrection details were inserted into manuscripts long after the original texts were completed. These weren't accidental copying errors. They were deliberate theological improvements made by scribes who believed the original texts were insufficiently clear about Christian doctrine. But here's what makes this deception so insidious. Each generation of scribes believed they were correcting errors made by previous copyists when in fact they were creating new errors that served their theological agenda. The text became progressively more Christian over time. Not because that's what the original authors intended, but because that's what later editors required. This process of textual manipulation reached its peak during the medieval period, when the Catholic Church achieved near monopolistic control over manuscript reproduction. Monks and scripturums across Europe weren't just copying texts. They were improving them, standardizing them, making them conform to official church doctrine. Any manuscript that deviated from approved theology was either corrected or destroyed. Any scribe who questioned these alterations was accused of heresy. The result was a systematic homogenization of Christian texts that eliminated evidence of early Christianity's theological diversity. Because early Christianity wasn't the unified movement that modern believers imagine. It was a chaotic collection of competing sects with radically different beliefs about who Jesus was, what he taught, and what his death meant. Some early Christians believed Jesus was fully human. Others thought he was fully divine. Still others claimed he was an illusion who never had a physical body at all. These weren't minor theological disagreements. They were fundamental conflicts about the nature of reality itself. And each group had their own texts, their own traditions, their own version of Jesus' story. The canonical Gospels represent just one strand of this early diversity, artificially elevated to supreme authority by imperial politics rather than historical accuracy. The Gnostic Gospels discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi in Egypt provide a glimpse of this lost diversity. These texts present a Jesus who teaches secret wisdom rather than public miracles. who emphasizes inner enlightenment over external authority, and who treats women as equal spiritual teachers rather than subordinate followers. But these weren't heretical innovations. They were early Christian traditions that were systematically suppressed when they became inconvenient to imperial Christianity. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, may preserve sayings of Jesus that are older and more authentic than anything in the canonical Gospels. But it was branded heretical because it didn't support the institutional Christianity that served imperial interests. This pattern of suppression and destruction continued for over a millennium. Every time Christianity encountered alternative religious traditions, the same process repeated. Sacred texts were burned. Temples were destroyed or converted. Priests were killed or converted. Entire spiritual traditions were erased from history. The Celtic Druids, the Germanic shamans, the Slavic nature religions, the Native American spiritual traditions, the African ancestral practices. All of these were systematically destroyed by Christian missionaries who claimed they were saving souls while they were actually destroying cultures. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this historical vandalism was how Christianity appropriated elements from the traditions it destroyed. Rather than simply eliminating competing religions, church authorities absorbed their most appealing features and rebranded them as Christian innovations. Christmas trees from Germanic winter festivals, Easter eggs from fertility celebrations, saints' feast days replacing local deity worship, holy wells and sacred groves converted into Christian pilgrimage sites, the Virgin Mary absorbing attributes from dozens of mother goddesses across the Mediterranean world. This wasn't cultural synthesis. It was cultural theft. Christianity didn't evolve naturally by incorporating diverse traditions. It conquered those traditions, stole their most powerful symbols, and claimed them as original Christian innovations while simultaneously destroying any record of their true origins. The result is that modern Christianity appears to be an organic religious development, when it's actually a carefully constructed imperial ideology, wearing the stolen clothes of the cultures it destroyed. Every major Christian symbol, ritual, and belief can be traced to pre-Christian sources that were systematically erased from us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Christianity: historical memory. But this brings his fraudulent history. The psychological techniques used to make people complicit in their own deception. Because the most effective lies aren't the ones imposed from outside. They're the ones that convince people to lie to themselves. Christianity perfected this art through what psychologists now recognize as sophisticated mind control techniques. Thought mantras disguised as prayers. Emotional manipulation disguised as worship. Social isolation disguised as spiritual community. Financial exploitation disguised as tithing. Intellectual surrender disguised as faith. The conversion process itself is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Potential converts are first convinced they are fundamentally flawed, sinful, broken, deserving of eternal punishment. Then they're offered salvation through accepting beliefs that contradict their rational judgment. Finally, they're taught that any doubts about these beliefs come from evil spiritual forces trying to deceive them. This creates a closed psychological system where questioning the beliefs becomes proof that the beliefs are true. Doubt is reframed as spiritual attack. Critical thinking is portrayed as pride and rebellion. Intellectual honesty is transformed into moral failure. Once this psychological trap is set, believers become self-policing. They suppress their own doubts, rationalize away contradictory evidence, and attack anyone who threatens their belief system. They don't need external censorship because they've internalized the censorship mechanisms. This explains why intelligent, educated people can continue believing in Christianity despite overwhelming evidence against its historical claims. They're not stupid. They've been psychologically conditioned to treat evidence as temptation and faith as virtue. The conditioning is so effective that many believers will defend Christianity more vigorously when presented with evidence against it. Psychologists call dissonance reduction this cognitive. When facts contradict beliefs, it's often easier to reject the facts than change the beliefs. especially when those beliefs are tied to personal identity and social relationships. Christianity exploits this psychological vulnerability by making belief a matter of moral character rather than intellectual honesty. Good people have faith. Bad people have doubts. This moral framing makes it almost impossible to examine Christian claims objectively because doing so feels like admitting moral failure. But the manipulation goes even deeper than individual psychology. Christianity also perfected techniques of social control that made entire populations complicit in maintaining the deception. Medieval European society is the perfect example of this system in operation. The Church controlled education so people learned only what supported Christian doctrine. The Church controlled literacy so only approved texts could be read. The Church controlled communication so dangerous ideas couldn't spread. The Church controlled economic opportunities so dissent meant poverty. The Church controlled social relationships so questioning beliefs meant isolation. This wasn't just religious authority. It was totalitarian control disguised as spiritual guidance. Every aspect of life was regulated according to Christian doctrine. Art, music, literature, science, philosophy, even personal relationships were subject to church approval. The result was a society where independent thinking became literally unthinkable. Not because people were incapable of it, but because the social and economic consequences of doubt were so severe that most people never allowed themselves to consider alternatives. This system of control was so effective that it survived the collapse of medieval feudalism and continues to influence modern society. The idea that religious beliefs deserve special protection from criticism, that faith is a private matter beyond rational discussion, that questioning someone's beliefs is somehow rude or inappropriate. All of these modern assumptions trace back to Christianity's historical success at making itself immune to scrutiny. But perhaps the most insidious legacy of Christian deception is how it corrupted the very concept of truth itself. Before Christianity's rise, truth was generally understood as correspondence to reality. Something was true if it accurately described the world as it actually exists. Christianity fundamentally altered this definition by making truth subordinate to faith. Something became true not because it matched reality but because it supported religious doctrine. This inversion of the truth concept has had catastrophic consequences for human intellectual development that persist to this day. Consider how this plays out in modern Christian apologetic. When archaeological evidence contradicts biblical claims, apologists don't abandon the claims. They create increasingly elaborate explanations to preserve them. When historical research reveals the fabricated nature of gospel stories, they don't accept the research. They attack the researcher's motives and methods. When scientific discoveries contradict religious doctrines, they don't modify the doctrines. They reject the science or create parallel pseudoscientific explanations that sound sophisticated, but lack any empirical foundation. This approach to truth is fundamentally dishonest because it starts with conclusions and then searches for evidence to support them rather than following evidence wherever it leads. It's the exact opposite of how genuine inquiry works. And it's poisoned not just religious thinking but entire culture's approach to knowledge and understanding. The anti-vaccination movement, climate change denial, conspiracy theories about evolution, rejection of historical evidence about slavery and genocide. All of these modern phenomena use the same epistemological framework that Christianity developed to protect itself from factual criticism. When you teach people that believing without evidence is virtuous, that questioning authority is sinful, and that faith is superior to reason, you don't just damage their religious thinking. You their ability to navigate reality itself. This is why the exposure of Christianity's fraudulent history isn't just an academic exercise. It's a crucial step in recovering humanity's capacity for honest inquiry. As long as billions of people are trained from childhood to accept claims without evidence, to suppress doubts rather than investigate them, and to treat belief as morally superior to knowledge, human civilization will continue to be vulnerable to deception and manipulation. The lies that built Christianity weren't just historical curiosities. They established patterns of deception, that continue to shape how power operates in the modern world. Political propaganda, corporate marketing, social media manipulation. All of these use techniques that Christianity perfected over centuries of practice. The difference is that modern deception usually has limited scope and duration. Political lies get exposed after elections. Corporate fraud gets revealed by investigative journalism. Social media manipulation gets documented by researchers. But religious deception has a unique advantage. It claims divine authority that places it beyond human criticism. When political leaders lie, we can vote them out. When corporations lie, we can sue them. But when religions lie, believers are taught that questioning the lies is a sin that deserves eternal punishment. This supernatural enforcement mechanism makes religious deception far more persistent and psychologically damaging than secular forms of manipulation. It's not just about controlling behavior. It's about controlling the very capacity to think clearly about the control itself. Breaking free from this psychological prison requires more than just learning about historical facts. It requires developing the emotional courage to face the possibility that everything you were taught about ultimate reality might be wrong. It requires the intellectual honesty to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads away from comforting beliefs. It requires the social strength to maintain relationships with people who might reject you for thinking differently. These aren't easy requirements, which explains why so many people prefer to remain in the prison of inherited beliefs, rather than risk the uncertainty of honest inquiry. But the alternative, continuing to live according to lies invented by ancient political operators, is far worse than the temporary discomfort of intellectual honesty. Because once you see the patterns of deception clearly, once you understand how thoroughly Christianity's history has been fabricated, you can't pretend the problems are minor or the solutions are simple. The entire structure of Western built on lies. And though civilization has been shaped by a religion, lies have infected every aspect of how we think about truth, authority, morality, and meaning. The task ahead isn't just exposing Christianity's fraudulent claims. It's rebuilding human culture on foundations of honesty rather than deception, evidence rather than faith, and reason rather than authority. It's the most important work any generation has ever faced. And it starts with the courage to admit that the greatest story ever told was actually the greatest lie ever sold. But that admission is just the beginning. What comes next will determine whether humanity can finally mature beyond the mythological thinking that has constrained our development for millennia, or whether we'll continue to be prisoners of lies invented by people who died 2,000 years ago. The choice is ours. But first, we have to see the chains clearly enough to break them. And those chains run deeper than most people imagine. Because Christianity's deception didn't stop with rewriting history and manipulating psychology. It extended to the very core of human identity, convincing people that they were fundamentally broken beings who needed external salvation rather than capable individuals who could think and act for themselves. This manufactured sense of inadequacy became the foundation for all subsequent Christian control. Because people who believe they are inherently flawed will accept almost any authority that promises to fix them. The greater the claimed flaw, the more desperate the need for salvation, and the more willing people become to surrender their autonomy to religious authorities who claim to have the cure. But here's where Christianity's psychological manipulation reaches its most sinister depths. The doctrine of original sin didn't just make people feel broken. It made them feel grateful for the breaking. Think about the twisted logic here. You're told from birth that you're so fundamentally corrupt that an innocent man had to die a torturous death just to make you acceptable to God. Then you're expected to feel grateful for this supposed sacrifice. This isn't love. It's the psychology of an abusive relationship scaled up to cosmic proportions. The abuser creates the problem, offers themselves as the solution, then demands eternal gratitude for solving a problem they created in the first place. It's manipulation so sophisticated that victims defend their abuser and attack anyone who points out the manipulation. The psychological damage this causes is immeasurable. Generations of children have been raised believing they're inherently evil. that their natural thoughts and desires are sinful, that they deserve eternal torture for being human. Then they're told the only escape is complete surrender to religious authority. Is it any wonder that cultures shaped by Christianity have struggled so much with shame, guilt, and self-hatred? Is it surprising that societies built on these foundations have produced such extraordinary levels of violence, oppression, and psychological dysfunction? But the doctrine of original sin serves another crucial function beyond psychological control. It eliminates the possibility of moral progress through human effort. If people are inherently evil, then they can't improve themselves through education, reason, or ethical development. They're permanently dependent on divine intervention and religious mediation. This theological trap has been used for centuries to justify inequality, oppression, and social stagnation. Why work to improve society if humans are inherently corrupt? Why pursue justice if only God can fix what's wrong with the world? Why trust human reason if it's been corrupted by sin? The result is a worldview that discourages human agency while promoting learned helplessness. People become passive consumers of religious salvation rather than active creators of their own meaning and purpose. They wait for divine rescue instead of taking responsibility for their own lives and communities. This passivity has had catastrophic consequences for human development. How many scientific discoveries were delayed because researchers were taught that human reason couldn't be trusted? How many social reforms were postponed because activists were told that only God could change hearts? How many individual lives were wasted because people believed they were too sinful to pursue their own happiness and fulfillment? The doctrine of original sin isn't just theologically false. It's psychologically destructive and socially paralyzing. It's designed to create permanent dependence on religious institutions while discouraging the kind of independent thinking and moral courage that might threaten religious authority. But even this level of psychological manipulation wasn't enough for Christianity's architects. They needed to ensure that their control system could adapt to changing circumstances, survive political upheavals, and maintain relevance across different cultures and time periods. So, they built in the ultimate escape clause: divine mystery. Whenever Christian claims are challenged by evidence, believers are told that God's ways are beyond human understanding. When Christian behavior contradicts Christian teachings, it's explained as part of God's mysterious plan. When prayers aren't answered, it's because God knows better than we do. When innocent people suffer while evil people prosper, it's all part of a divine purpose we can't comprehend. This doctrine of divine mystery isn't just a theological concept. It's a conversation stopper designed to shut down critical thinking. It makes Christianity immune to factual criticism because any inconvenient fact can be dismissed as part of God's unknowable wisdom. The psychological effect is devastating. People learn to distrust their own observations, their own reasoning, their own moral intuitions. They're taught that when reality contradicts their beliefs, reality must be wrong. They develop what psychologists call learned helplessness, the conviction that they can't understand or control their own lives. But here's what makes this manipulation even more insidious. It's often presented as humility. Believers are told that accepting divine mystery shows proper reverence for God's infinite wisdom. Questioning religious claims is portrayed as arrogant presumption. Intellectual honesty becomes pride and willful ignorance becomes virtue. This inversion of values has profound consequences beyond religious belief. When people are trained to see intellectual curiosity as sinful and unquestioning acceptance as virtuous, they become vulnerable to all forms of authoritarian manipulation. Political leaders, corporate executives, and social movements can exploit the same psychological mechanisms that Christianity uses to maintain control. The pattern is always the same. Claim special authority that places you beyond criticism. Present complex problems in simplistic terms that only you can solve. Demand unquestioning loyalty from followers and dismiss any challenges as evidence of moral or intellectual failure on the part of the questioner. This is why exposing Christianity's fraudulent history is so crucial for human freedom. It's not just about correcting historical inaccuracies. It's about breaking the psychological chains that prevent people from thinking clearly about authority, evidence, and truth itself. Once you see how Christianity manipulates believers into defending lies they're not allowed to examine, you start recognizing the same patterns everywhere. Political propaganda, corporate marketing, social media echo chambers. They all use techniques that Christianity perfected over centuries of practice. But Christianity has one advantage that secular forms of manipulation lack. It claims supernatural authority that makes resistance seem not just wrong, but cosmically dangerous. When politicians lie, you might lose an election. When corporations lie, you might lose money. But when God lies, you lose your soul for eternity. This supernatural enforcement mechanism makes religious deception uniquely powerful and uniquely difficult to overcome. It's not enough to show that the claims are false. You have to help people overcome their terror of divine punishment for thinking forbidden thoughts. And that terror is real. Even people who intellectually reject Christianity often struggle with lingering fears about eternal damnation. The psychological conditioning runs so deep that rational arguments alone aren't enough to break it. The evidence is overwhelming. The patterns undeniable. The deception complete. We've journeyed through 2 millennia of fabrication, manipulation, and historical vandalism. From the impossible census that never happened to the virgin birth built on mistranslation. From the contradictory genealogies to the phantom witnesses. From the anonymous gospels to the manufactured martyrs. Every foundation stone of Christianity crumbles under honest examination. This isn't just the collapse of a religious narrative. This is the exposure of history's most successful fraud. A deception so comprehensive that it convinced billions to dedicate their lives to defending lies they were never permitted to question. The psychological manipulation. The systematic destruction of evidence. The corruption of truth itself. All orchestrated to maintain power while claiming divine authority. But here's what gives me hope. You've made it this far. You've seen the evidence. You followed the trail of deception to its source. And that means the spell is breaking. The carefully constructed prison of inherited belief is cracking. And truth is finally breaking through. The lies that built Christianity have shaped human civilization for 2,000 years. But they don't have to shape our future. We can choose evidence over faith, reason over authority, honesty over comfortable deception. We can reclaim our capacity for critical thinking, our right to ask questions, our freedom to follow truth wherever it leads. The greatest story ever told was actually the greatest lie ever sold. But now that you know the truth, the question becomes, what will you do with it? The choice is yours. But you can never unknow what you've learned here. The chains of ancient deception are finally visible. Whether you break them is up to you.